The ontological point here is that different individuated modes, different aspects, may enjoy numerical identity. Given that temporal succession is a type of qualitative distinction, i.e. I got that wrong, a type of quantitative distinction, a series of numeric values associated with successive occurrences of the term t. This implies that no temporal succession need obtain among discrete aspects of the same social form. The implications for the putative evolution among individuated modes of production are staggering here. Deleuze's ontological reflections suggest that explicitly dynamic, coexisting, implicated modes of production enjoy a type of variation which involves no temporal serialized evolution. The substantive claim here is that coexisting entities enjoy immanent variation. I suggest that Deleuze and Guattari echo Marx's claims about the involvement of the modes of economic production of society. Though Deleuze and Guattari accept Marx's suggestion that the modes of economic production play a role in the identification of society as belonging to a particular temporal period or age, they expunge temporal succession from evolutionism. The argument that I'm presenting involves three complex stages. First, specification of Marx's claim that social evolution is stochastic variation. Second, the observation that Deleuze and Guattari suggest that social variation involves temporally instantaneous, that is non-serialized, non-successive relation of coexisting modes of organization. Third, the suggestion derived from Spinoza that immanent causality is an adequate mechanism to account for social change. Taken together, these yield the suggestion that Deleuze and Guattari's analyses of time comprehend the instantaneous, non-successive, non-serializable variation of coexisting contemporaneous aspects of society. So that's basically the schema of the argument that I'm presenting. Now, diving into the first part on Marx. This was the part that received the most severe cuts. So, basically, Deleuze and Guattari they specify their fidelity to Marx in Anti-Oedipus when they say the rules of Marx are followed exactly. And you're like, okay, great. And then they don't bother to tell what these rules are. And Marx really doesn't ever specify, here are my rules. So it's like, okay. But how these rules apply is not really apparent, in the sense that Marx seems to never tire of critically reassessing the various ages of economic production. And just a quick, I don't want to bore us with textual references, but German ideology. There are four discrete modes of temporal periods in the German ideology. Great. In the Communist Manifesto, there are three. And then in the various letters between both Marx and Engels and various other commentators, this list just expands and contracts depending on what they're writing at the moment. The takeaway of what these modes of production are like, and German feudalism preceded by the Asiatic mode of production, followed by, and then this is followed by capitalism, and then this is followed by something else that Marx vaguely hints at but doesn't give a, post-capitalism. Okay. How long do these durations last? Where are they present? Is the Asiatic mode of production merely present in Asia? No. Is it present? Is German feudalism merely present in Germany during the medieval period? No. That much is apparent from Marx. these things bounce around. And so what are we to take away from that? Well, Marx's modifications of the nature, number, and function of the modes of production suggest that social and economic development express a non-linear evolution. So non-linear, it's not first this, then this, then this. He modified it too much to suggest that you can attribute any linearity to it. The concept of non-linear evolution here is derived from Iberol's suggestion that a sequence of events may emerge as arrhythmic temporal series, i.e. a temporal series characterized by irregular, non-symmetric intervals between the occurrence of events, a series in which temporal durations are non-identical with each other, a temporal series constituted by stochastic moments. There are two claims supporting the analytic point that the modes of production participate in non-linear evolutionary sequence. One, a properly Marxian account of the modes of production demonstrates that on a local level, internal to a society, there could exist discrete modes of production, each of which may express a temporality that is incommensurable to any other. They make things at different rates within the same society, comprehended by the same duration. So that's the first analytic point. Second analytic point. Formal identity obtains among the modes of production, even if these enjoy non-equivalent durations. They are still formally identical. What is the form? They are the modes of production. The first claim suggests a difficulty for an account of the evolution as a linear process by introducing the coexistence of different temporal scales. A linear ordering would suggest a neat and tidy chronometric unfolding from one mode of production to another. The claim that there are different durations involved with different modes of production suggests the absence of unified time. In this sense, one of the minimal conditions of linear evolution is denied by Marx's observation that the modes of production involve temporal durations. The claim that different modes of production might obtain as non-identical durations confounds the suggestion that evolution is linear. The second claim, that the modes of production enjoy formal identity, preserves evolution in a modified sense. The key observation is that formal identity does not imply temporal identity. The same form may obtain at different times. The same form may enjoy different durations. A second key crucial implication is that identical forms may be arrayed as moments of a continuum of irregular intervals. When these moments are identified as temporal moments, and this continuum is identified as temporal, the ordering of forms yields a series of temporal successions that tends to characterize evolution. So, from the observation that these forms may enjoy different durations, we may adduce that evolution enjoys stochastic succession from one type of production to another. It is inadequate to characterize this as linear evolution. From one mode of production to another, society proceeds in a stochastic fashion. That's where Marx leaves us, or that's where Deleuze and Guattari, more accurately, leave Marx, and they they develop that. Deleuze and Guattari begin their modification of Marx's account of evolution by questioning, in the 11th proposition of their nomadology, which of the state or primitive social groupings, tribes of nomads, enjoy temporal priority? Which came first is the question. Ultimately, Deleuze and Guattari suggest that economic evolutionism is an impossibility. Even a ramified evolution, gatherers, hunters, animal breeders, farmer industrialists, is hardly believable. That was a quote. The claim here could hardly be less ambiguous. evolution does not obtain as an expression of temporal progression. The relation of temporal succession, which is implicit in both linear and stochastic evolutionary models, does not obtain as an aspect of an adequate account in the development of human societies. The state and non-state social formations are temporally coexistent entities. No ontological dependency relation exists between them. It would be difficult to overstate the significance of that. We are like rewriting how history unfolds here. This is not that, like, this is not the Marxian view that, oh, first there was the city, and then the city went out to the farms, and this is not the alternative view that, and like Jane Jacobs's view is based on the archaeological record. She is like, well, the city has grain in it. Like, ancient cities have grain, they have urban farms, and then they just moved out into the fields from the city. Deleuze and Guattari are not suggesting that. It's not the city came first and the farms second, and it's not that the farms somehow developed surplus value over multiple millennia and then moved to the city and formed there. That's not their claim. It's not which came first. It's like, no, they came together. Deleuze and where do they get this from? Pierre Clastres, Society Against the State. Deleuze and Guattari begin their... No, okay, I read that. So what does Clastres observe? Clastres observes that the leader of a tribe is non-identical to a head of state. He's talking about tribal chiefs or clan leaders. They tend to be generous to such an extreme degree that this diminishes any accumulation of surplus wealth. When you take all of Clastres together, what he seems to say is that it is inadequate to identify the relation of tribal social organization and the state or urban organization as any sort of evolution. It would be a misstatement to suggest that any one of these is entirely intuitive or self-evident. Indeed, if each inferential step involved in Deleuze and Guattari's argument is compelling, then their conclusion is really mind-blowing. That basically it all came about at once. Deleuze and Guattari claims about, so let's get a bit more into this Jacobs thing. It involves a modification of Jacobs' suggestion that the primitive agrarian social collectives antedate or precede the state. Jacobs observes that the dogma of agricultural primacy is fallacious, in the sense that it is misguided to suggest that cities are built upon a rural economic base. Jacob presents her argument in economic terms. She observes that rural production is literally the creation of city consumption. This is a reversal of the economic progression elaborated in Marxian evolutionary theory. No longer is the rural society thought of as the cradle of the city. This implies a reversal of the development of the order suggested by Marxian evolutionism. Given that this order is explicitly temporal suggestion, this suggests that the evolutionary models should be inverted. Deleuze and Guattari take that and run with it. In their analyses of Clastres suggests that it is misguided to think of social groups of antiquity will evolve into state formations, as though an analog of contemporary political arrangements enjoyed by the so-called civilized nations may be retrogressively predicated of primitive tribes like some sort of a mega point to which their development naturally tends. Classe starkly observes that primitive societies are societies without a state, because for them the state is impossible. It's not an unfulfilled concept. It's impossible. It's not part of their conceptual apparatus by which they apprehend reality. The implication of Deleuze and Guattari's analysis of class race can be expressed with the satisfaction of a conditional. If primitive societies do not evolve into states, but states exist, and they do, then this implies that the state has always existed. Deleuze and Guattari identify the omnipresent state as the Urstadt. Deleuze and Guattari elucidate their complex views on socioeconomic evolution and temporal succession through two separate arguments. The suggestion that there is variable evolution within a given society does nothing to diminish the suggestion that an evolutionary pattern might obtain in the historical movement from one age to the next. Were this sort of evolution to obtain as a hypothesis about the nature of historical progress, it could be expressed as a relation of temporal succession on the grand scale of temporal movement between ages or epochs. Alternatively, this evolutionary hypothesis could be identified as a sequential prioritization of one mode of production over another, with the stipulation that this correlates with the progression of the historical progression of temporal moments, culminating in the unification of urban civilization. Deleuze and Guattari seem to be suggesting something way more radical than this. The implied non-linear evolution of society in 1,000 Plateaus. And they have quotes like, a state comes into the world fully formed and rises up in a single stroke as the unconditioned Urstadt. This amounts to a denial of there being any evolutionary process that leads to the formation of the state. In concrete terms, Deleuze and Guattari's Urstadt thesis suggests that the state arises spontaneously as an ontologically autonomous circumstance that is discrete from both rural life and temporally graduated evolutionary progress of the incorporation of discrete rural settlements into a unified cooperative. The city and the country, characterized as different modes of existing in the city and the country, characterized as different modes of existence involving different concrete material entities and physical processes of creating goods, are realized as temporally coexisting entities, that is, as existence with no temporal duration separating them. Their stipulation of the fundamental existence of the Urstadt, Deleuze and Guattari are suggesting that human development is bereft of temporal succession. So, that's the end of the second truncated section. Third is just Spinoza. Deleuze and Guattari's, and it's kind of short, we can trim this up a bit more here. Okay, so Deleuze and Guattari's identification of the temporally primary actualization of the Urstadt may be characterized as putting the final nail in the lid of the philosophical coffin containing the plurality of related concepts. Social evolution, no. Linear causality, no. Temporal succession, no. Evolutionist accounts of social change tend to involve at least one of linear causality or temporal succession. In addition to denying that social evolution obtains in serialized fashion, the Urstadt thesis implies that if linear causality or temporal succession obtain at all, these are inadequate to account for societal change. Deleuze and Guattari suggest that so then you're like, okay, so that doesn't work, what does? They suggest an adequate account relies on neither regular progression from one moment to another, doesn't rely on linear causality, it doesn't rely on temporal succession. Their positive claim is that multiple analytically discrete modes coexist in a single duration. They are realized as different aspects of the same temporal duration, as identical modes of the same temporally unified social substance, as contemporaneous implicated modes. These suggest that the internal variations of Erstadt involve ontological univocity and immanent causality. Here, in a modification of Spinoza, and Deleuze and Guattari suggest that coexisting modes of economic production, their modes of being, their social modes of existence, affect one another in the same duration. And I say, like, why is this a modification of Spinoza? Because Spinoza didn't talk about it. That's all. Like, he's talking about God and the modes in Ethics 1. But, okay, so what are the modes? Well, these are the social modes. These are not merely the economic modes of production, but they are certainly modal. Okay, Deleuze's careful identification of univocity as the suggestion that being is said in a single and same sense of all its individuating differences and intrinsic modalities informs an account of the causal relations that obtain among different modes of society. The stipulation of that social formations are differently individuated aspects which obtain in the same duration, as aspects of the same form of time, implies a modification of these aspects does not involve temporal succession. This is a unique sort of change indeed, a change of an irreducible, non-quantitatively divisible temporal duration, modification which occurs in the midst of a non-denumerable duration, innovation or invention in an instant which defies the most fine-tuned numeric division, creation involved in the smallest morsel of time, individuation as an expression of temporal immanence. This plurality of formulations implies that immanent causal relations obtain among mutually implicated modes, social modes. Social change is expressed as temporally instantaneous, non-successive modification of coexisting elements. So if variation is explained by temporal succession, okay. So Deleuze explicitly notes that his concept of immanent causality is derived from E1P18, where Spinoza identifies God as the immanent cause of all existent entities. Spinoza's demonstration involves two conditionals. One, the stipulation that all existence participate in divine substance. Everything that is in God. Everything that is in God. Two, the claim that divine substance is the cause of all that comprehends, i.e., that is, quote, God is the cause of all things which are in him, end quote. Spinoza explicitly states at E1P18 that divine substance is, begin quote, is the immanent, not the transitive cause of all things. Deleuze observes in Expressionism and Philosophy, the big one, that Spinoza's metaphysics, attributes are conditions common to substance which possess them collectively and to which modes which imply them distributively. When coupled with the observation that both causes and effects are types of attribute which enjoy discrete distribution as modes, this lays the conceptual foundation for immanent causality. Taken together, these suggest that in an immanent causal relation, analytically discrete moments of cause and effect are inexorably bound together at the level of substance. They are common to substance and expressed as analytically discrete modes of the same unified whole. In Spinoza, Practical Philosophy, Deleuze explicitly observes that this fundamental unity of cause and effect is what separates an immanent cause from both transitive cause and causation involving emanation. Here the claim seems to be that it is inaccurate to characterize divine substance as a remote causal agent which influences modal variation from a privileged ontological position. Stated positively, divine substance is implicated in the modal expression of change. Deleuze further stipulates that this divine substance is implicated in the effect of modal variation. In this sense, the effect is ontologically involved with the causal agent, and all of these enjoy temporally simultaneous expression. This amounts to modal variation in an instant, in which every aspect of modification, all of substance, cause, and effect, obtain as calm present. Here the implication is that an adequate account of change among coexistent modal expressions of the same entity involves the mutual implication of each mode, expressed mode, as an aspect of causal relation. That is, each mode is implicated as a relata in a causal relation that obtains as an aspect of temporally unified, undifferentiated duration. No relation of temporal succession obtains in this causal relation, because the duration which comprehends the relation is fundamentally unified. It is non-decomposable into discrete temporal instances. Those united by immanent causality cannot be torn asunder by temporal succession. And now I just have my concluding remarks, which summarizes my argument, but we can just rehashes it. But basically, we can call it a day there. What did I say? I said, okay, in Marx, evolution is stochastic. Jacobs challenges this a bit and says, Marx had it wrong. The city came first, and it wasn't the Asiatic mode of production that wasn't a bunch of farmers struggling for thousands of years to produce surplus value, which honestly, it's difficult. Like, there is that mystery. How did they suddenly do this, right? Like, multiple generations of acquiring grain, no. So Jacobs rejects that. Clausewitz doesn't reject Jacobs. That would sound too hostile, but he just radicalizes it and says, no, the state and society obtain instantaneously, or the state and the rural obtain instantaneously at the same time as competing entities. Deleuze and Guattari like that. And then there's a question, okay, so they obtain all at once. How does society change? What's going on here? Because literally, they obtain all at once. So there's no linear temporal succession. There's no linear causal relation. So we need a different form of causality. What is left there? Well, Spinoza to the rescue. And what is it? It's immanent causality, where cause and effect are implicated in the same undifferentiated, the same substance as different aspects. And that's it. That's all.
Buenos días. Voy a dar la ponencia en español porque bueno, en fin, yo quiero hablarles en esta ocasión, dadas las líneas generales de este coloquio. En la traducción se oyen terribles, ¿no? Pero lo voy a hacer a propósito para enfatizar el asunto. Controlismo, nomadismo, fronterismo, ¿no? Bueno, no lo diríamos así en castellano correctamente, pero creo que insinúan un movimiento para la acción de resistencia, ¿no? Y es a lo que yo me he dedicado los últimos años, al tema de resistencia política. En este mismo coloquio he hablado de resistencia en ocasiones pasadas, pero ahora quiero desplazarme un poco para hablar de aquella base epistemológica, de aquella base de percepción del mundo que tendría que ponerse en cuestión para llegar a ese otro momento, ¿no? Para llegar al momento de la acción. No lo veo tanto como causa y efecto. En Deleuze y Guattari no hay este movimiento tan enfático, pero creo que sí vale la pena ver un momento anterior de rompimiento, de crisis de nuestro enfoque epistemológico y de la percepción, y para esto me voy a servir de dos lecturas de dos novelas, ¿no? Entonces, como ven, voy armando un entramado literario, político, filosófico, ¿no? Las dos novelas, se trata, la primera, la de Michel Tournier, Viernes o los ritmos del Pacífico, que Deleuze aborda en la lógica del sentido, al final, ¿no? Y la otra es Faux de Coetzee, y van a ver cómo las dos ponen en crisis, las dos ponen en cuestionamiento esta base epistemológica y quieren acción, ¿no? Quieren dirigirse hacia la acción. ¿Cuál es esa acción? Para decirlo en pocas palabras, la apertura del otro, la apertura con el otro hacia lo que podamos hacer, ¿no? Es decir, el rompimiento del sujeto, del yo fijo y sobre todo en su versión kantiana del yo trascendental, ¿no? En eso me voy a concentrar. Entonces, bueno, de inmediato doy lectura al paper. Son las 11, ya me llevé 2 minutos antes, entonces tengo 18 minutos. En Deleuze y Guattari se encuentra la implosión de exuberancia creativa de un estilo que va de la descomposición a la composición y de esta a aquella. Una y otra vez, describiendo una suerte de cadencia musical que es la clave de su invención de conceptos. Una y otra vez de lo que se descompone a lo que se compone y de lo que se compone a lo que se descompone en un vaivén pendular inquietante, rebelde, antidogmático, si por dogma se entiende la fijación de las palabras en preceptos pretendidamente inalterables. Por una parte, este estilo opera como la descomposición de una sintaxis y una semántica, de toda regla de la teoría lingüística sobre la pulcritud y la buena escritura. En este sentido, es la descomposición del discurso definitivo en cuanto a parámetros de la buena literatura, entre comillas, o del discurso fundamentado y último, académicamente hablando. Pero también opera como descomposición de un orden del pensamiento que se quiere sistemático, consecutivo y fiel a una progresión siempre unitaria, llámese dialéctica moderna o metafísica antigua. Dando por sentado que esta progresión del pensamiento pretende ser idéntica a sí misma en cuanto su ideal es la absoluta consistencia interna de su pragmática lingüística, de aquello que quiere decir y hacer con palabras, el estilo de Deleuze y Guattari desplaza y lleva a su extremo tal pragmática del lenguaje al poner en evidencia su inconsistencia inherente. Por otra parte, aunque siempre de forma concomitante, paralela y en más de una ocasión anidada a la operación de descomposición, su estilo se revela como una plétora de formas de composición. Es el carácter constructivo que une lo que se creía separado antinómicamente, que liga por conexiones subversivas nunca admitidas por la escolástica dogmática, sea platónica, aristotélica, kantiana, hegeliana, habermasiana, etc., cualquier tipo de escolástica. Nunca acepta lo que fue dividido y enfrentado en binomios conceptuales irreconciliables: copia y esencia ideal, sustancia y accidente, facultad del sujeto y flujo de la expresión de la vida, disenso y consenso. También se trata de una composición rítmica. Busca armonías siempre localizadas, siempre contingentes, entre ritornelos que forman un bucle y una constante sonora de reiteración expresiva que tiene que ver con la expresión de la vida en cuanto potencia de generar relaciones múltiples, novedosas. El estilo de expresión de su escritura se alinea a la expresión de un flujo vital que se expande y se manifiesta por ello. Es por esto que se puede enfatizar la función de lo que llama Deleuze personajes conceptuales como verdaderas encarnaciones y confluencias de estilo de un filósofo y la expresión de aquello que habla por su medio. Si recordamos ese capitulito de ¿qué es la filosofía?, donde trata los personajes conceptuales, ahí los describe como verdadero medium de expresión, de un plano de inmanencia que atraviesa la escritura de un filósofo, que se encarna en estos personajes conceptuales. Por ejemplo, el idiota en Deleuze, perdón, en Descartes, Zaratustra en Nietzsche, los anónimos en Kierkegaard. Bueno, todo esto lo trata en ese pequeño capitulito. A mí lo que me interesa más adelante, que me parece que por la hora ya voy a saltar a ese asunto, es cómo Michel Tournier y Coetzee enfatizan esta cuestión de personajes conceptuales que son el verdadero medium de expresión de un pensamiento, ¿no? De un pensamiento que, como decía al principio, rompe fuertemente con un esquema epistemológico del yo. Entonces salto allá, tenía algunas otras cosas que decir del estilo, pero mejor me salto esto para llegar al verdadero meollo del asunto que me interesa. En la novela Viernes o los Limbos del Pacífico, de Michel Tournier, se juegan los juegos que le interesan a Deleuze, sobre todo entre un yo, un otro y un otro. No hay que confundir entonces la oposición antinómica yo-otro, que daría ocasión a que el otro, con minúscula digamos, reduplique lo que hace el yo y quiere oponerse a él simplemente copiándolo, ¿no? Cuando Deleuze se pone a estudiar a Lucrecio, al final de la lógica del sentido también, analiza estos juegos, ¿no? Juegos entre un yo, un otro y un otro. Este es el que le interesa, este último, el otro con mayúscula. Voy a adelantar una idea como campo trascendental, pero vamos con calma. Estos juegos del yo, su otro y el otro suponen ser el verdadero compromiso para una racionalidad cerrada a una tercera dimensión de otredad que no puede absorberse simplemente por el yo, y por ello distorsionan el pequeño reino insular de Crusoe y su paz, su orden, su legalidad y su poder, su egotismo. En fin, en la versión clásica de la novela, de lo que se trata es de Robinson Crusoe que llega a una isla y la conquista y la domina. Esto es lo que va a romper tanto la versión de Michel Tournier como la versión de Coetzee. Estos juegos del yo, su otro y el otro yo, alteran la influencia que Crusoe siente por escapar de la isla, de su mundo ya configurado y asegurado, justo porque ya no se puede estar en la isla cuando ese otro radical vuelve a aparecer, tras haber cerrado las posibilidades de percibirlo siquiera, mucho menos de tomarlo en cuenta para configurar el mundo con sentido. Esta es la perspectiva que elabora Gilles Deleuze a partir de la lectura de Viernes o los Limbos del Pacífico, de Michel Tournier, lectura que coincide en su plataforma crítica con la que vamos a establecer la versión que hace Coetzee en Foucault, en el sentido de que ambas cuestionan el supuesto antropológico, ontológico y epistemológico del yo que se impone al otro. Para Deleuze, lo que pone en juego la novela de Tournier, diferenciándose así completamente de otras versiones de Robinson Crusoe, incluida la original de Defoe, es el proyecto de la Robinsonada llevada a su verdadera condición de posibilidad. Pensar los efectos de un mundo sin el otro. Esto es, pensar la posibilidad de que el yo desintegre su subjetividad radicalmente y con ella su percepción del mundo tal como está configurada por el otro, para dar paso a una configuración del mundo en donde ya no existe más yo y otro por separado, sino una mezcla del yo con su mundo de tal forma que se vuelven indistinguibles. O en palabras de Deleuze, el objetivo el objetivo final de Robinson es la deshumanización, el encuentro de la libido con los elementos libres, el descubrimiento de una energía cósmica o de una gran salud, con mayúscula, elemental, que no puede surgir sino en la isla. El Robinson de Tournier es para Deleuze el caso extremo de desviación de los fines que sostienen un mundo humano. El trabajo y la producción, la economía y el orden de las reglamentaciones y los hábitos culturales, incluso la cordura o lo que llamamos salud mental. Su comportamiento, afirma Deleuze, puede describirse como el de un perverso, en tanto que se desvía de los fines que imponen como ganancia de la civilización a la que va renunciando poco a poco, en tanto su contacto con Viernes se torna más creativo y deja de luchar contra la isla para imponerse a ella. La tesis de Deleuze se sostiene en una novedad de interpretación de la epistemología idealista y de la ontología realista. Si se define al otro, con mayúsculas, si se define al otro no como un individuo con el que se tiene relación, sino como condición de posibilidad de percepción del mundo, universal y trascendental, justo la función que tiene para Kant el yo trascendental, entonces se puede definir el mundo como la organización de objetos e ideas hecha posible por esa estructura a priori que es el otro. Y cito de nuevo a Deleuze: el otro no es ni objeto en el campo de mi percepción, ni un sujeto que me percibe. Es, en primer lugar, una estructura del campo perceptivo, sin el cual este campo, en su conjunto, no funcionaría como lo hace. Así, el otro a priori, como estructura absoluta, funda la relatividad de los otros como términos que efectúan la estructura de cada campo. Pero ¿cuál es esta estructura? Y responde él mismo: es la de lo posible. Entonces, el otro como campo trascendental, como estructura de percepción del mundo, abre el mismo mundo como posibilidad. Y mi tesis, la tesis final, que ya no voy a tener tiempo de desarrollar aquí, pero que sí apunto a ella, es la posibilidad como acción de conflictividad, como acción de nomadismo, etc. Puede decirse, agrega Deleuze, que el otro así considerado modela mi mundo, lo hace temible o deseable, odioso o amable, porque siempre aparece como previsibilidad de lo que ocurrirá en ese mundo, del sentido o sin sentido que tendrá para mí, esto es, como posibilidad o expresión de un mundo posible. Ahora bien, lo que describe la novela experimental inductiva, estas son palabras del mismo Deleuze, experimental inductiva de Tournier, a partir de las experiencias internas, emocionales y conceptuales de Robinson Crusoe en su isla, es la desaparición o desmoronamiento de esta posibilidad de percepción del mundo que se debe a la mediación del otro. Es decir, y lo cito, la disolución progresiva de la estructura del otro se nos presenta como debida a ciertas circunstancias de la isla desierta. Ahí acaba la cita. Esta disolución progresiva de la estructura del otro es irreversible. Ha hecho pasar a Robinson por experiencias que rayan con la psicosis como desintegración de su yo. O incluso cuando llega Viernes ya no puede verlo como un otro. Se ve transformado por una soledad tal que la perversión de los fines de su relación puede explicarse como la imposibilidad de asignar la función de otro a otro. Paso a una pequeña explicación ahora de Faux de Coetzee. Como el Robinson de Tournier, el de Coetzee también ha suspendido o alterado irremediablemente la configuración trascendental de su percepción del mundo. El otro como estructura ha desaparecido de su horizonte. Si bien el experimento de Tournier es hacer confundir a sus personajes con la isla en un juego de fusión de los elementos que tendría que ser salvífico, colmado de una salud elemental a renunciar a la humanidad, el experimento de Coetzee se mantiene en la lucha con la isla, con un sentido de ella que no puede ser aprendido ni estando en ella ni habiendo salido. Los personajes se empecinan en contar una historia que no aparece, y es ahí donde ocurren las discusiones, que parecen interminables, sobre el sentido de escribir. Pero aunque los personajes de Coetzee se mantienen en una lucha contra la isla, los resultados son los mismos que en el experimento de Deleuze. El trastorno fundamental del mundo cuando el otro ha sido ocluido o ignorado. A diferencia de la versión de Tournier, para los personajes de Coetzee, la isla se revela como un antiparaíso. El jardín, el mítico jardín del deseo, se invierte en la condena de trabajo forzoso e inútil. Es decir, los personajes de la novela de Coetzee están destinados a trabajar para dominar a la isla, y este dominio lleva a Robinson a la muerte. Ahí tenemos a un viernes muy peculiar, que es un viernes al que le han extirpado la lengua, entonces no puede hablar, pero en la versión de Coetzee es el único que habla al final. Claro, habla desde el delirio, ¿no? Ya no habla con palabras, sino en el delirio. Bueno, Crusoe y Viernes han dedicado, en la versión de Coetzee, Crusoe y Viernes han dedicado 15 años a limpiar un páramo de piedras y maleza y establecer sus límites, levantando muros hechizos de piedra, en una preparación del terreno para la siembra que nunca se hizo y que nunca llegará, al carecer de cualquier clase de semillas. En un sentido alegórico, analógico, la semilla del deseo está también ausente. Crusoe tiene una sola relación sexual con Susan Barton. Bueno, esta es otra novedad que Coetzee nos da en Fo, que aparece una mujer que también llega a la isla, náufraga, tiene una función muy importante cuando habla con Robinson, y va a tener una sola relación sexual con él, que va a cambiar la percepción del otro completamente. Crusoe tiene una sola relación sexual con Susan Barton, perdiendo el interés casi de inmediato, negándola como presencia femenina efectiva y tratándola como un súbdito más de la isla. La inutilidad del trabajo se corresponde aquí a una incapacidad erótica. Son dos violencias básicas: el trabajo inútil, la sexualidad impedida, que hacen triste y absurda la vida en la isla. Es por esto que puede decirse que la analogía con el mito de Sísifo es algo más que un lugar común aquí. Sísifo fue castigado por los dioses a cargar una piedra enorme hasta lo alto de una colina, hecho lo cual, como todos sabemos, bueno, la piedra rueda por la pendiente y su trabajo absurdo comienza una y otra vez eternamente. El Crusoe de Coetzee se empeña en desbrozar la tierra de su isla para plantear una semilla inexistente. Levanta su reino en el absurdo. Aquí la referencia a la interpretación ya clásica de Albert Camus, el esfuerzo, el trabajo, el empeño de una existencia cae en el absurdo de su repetición autómata, se puede entrelazar con la tesis deleuziana sobre la desaparición del otro como dador de sentido y condición de posibilidad de configuración del mundo. Es en la novela de Coetzee donde estas dos líneas de interpretación se pueden enhebrar: la falta de una motivación esencial de la persistencia en el trabajo en la isla, que no puede relatar Fo, que Susan Barton quisiera contar pero no sabe cómo, y que Viernes porta pero se ve imposibilitado de expresar. Todo ello es síntoma de que la posibilidad de mundo que otorga el otro, la posibilidad que como categoría del mundo, ha desaparecido. Y ya para ir cerrando, que me queda un minutito. El otro como estructura a priori de percepción del mundo ha desaparecido. Esto equivale a decir que el otro singular ya no es visto como fuente de posibilidades de encarnación de esta estructura. Podemos decir que se ha cosificado, que ya no se le ve como otro, sino como instrumento o estorbo de una empresa, en el mejor de los casos. Y en el peor, se le ignora, se le hace desaparecer. Es en la renovación del sentido que propone, perdón por esta cuestión, pero que propone Axel Honneth. Sé que estoy en las antípodas del pensamiento deleuziano aquí, pero solo me interesa Honneth como una referencia para hablar de la cosificación, y en un momento, justo en este momento, coincide con Deleuze. Habrá que elaborar mucho esto, porque estamos en las antípodas del pensamiento, ¿no? Bueno, se ha reificado el otro. El yo se ha perdido en una costumbre de percepción en la que ya no tiene la sensibilidad perceptiva y cultural de asignarle una postura al otro como tal otro. Es por esto que Viernes se ve imposibilitado en última instancia para aprender cualquier forma de comunicación. No entiende cómo salir de su propia reificación, ese lugar asignado por el yo que se ha convertido en una verdadera prisión para él. Pero es esta condición aprisionada que lo caracteriza, lo que anida en el lector como posibilidad de disparar su propia acción. Es esta condición reificada lo que provoca un malestar en el lector que ya contiene, al menos como posibilidad, el rechazo a tal reificación. Y es desde este rechazo que se puede organizar una resistencia de tipo intersticial hacia el estado de cosas que así se pone al descubierto, tanto en la trama no cerrada, no conclusiva de la novela, como en la otra trama política y cultural del mundo del lector, asimisma no cerrada ni conclusiva. Bueno, es esta.
Julián Ferreira nos acompaña de la Universidad de Buenos Aires y nos va a presentar con el título
El tiempo de la precariedad.
El tiempo de la precariedad. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias ante todo a los organizadores, Patricio, a José, a Cristina por todo el esfuerzo, por tenernos todos aquí. Voy a hablar también en castellano. Poner un controlador de tiempo. Si voy a hablar del tiempo, necesito tener el tiempo medido mínimamente. Estamos en un tiempo de la precariedad, pero ¿siempre fue precario el tiempo? ¿O es la precariedad un signo de nuestro tiempo? Es un tiempo que no puede expresarse en presente, porque en él todas las dimensiones coexisten. El pasado puro que engendra y un futuro que no cesa de nacer cuando pasa. Estamos en un tiempo en estado puro y fuera de sus goznes, y por eso es precario, porque se destruye a medida que se construye, o se construye en medio de su perecer. Ese es nuestro tiempo, que es todos los tiempos, en tanto en nuestro tiempo coexisten múltiples capas del tiempo, pero cuya misma precariedad indica que no fue así desde siempre, que no será así para siempre, porque no es el tiempo de la eternidad y tampoco es el círculo de lo mismo. Ese es nuestro tiempo, salvaje, pero también creador, ya que crea sus cristales donde queda efímeramente atrapado, congelado, un circuito de pasado y presente, de virtual y actual. Esos cristales son nuestras moradas, nuestros ritorneros, nuestras cancioncitas en medio de la oscuridad y el caos, que tarareamos como niños perdidos en el espeso bosque de la existencia. Estamos aquí, en este bello auditorio de la Universidad Autónoma de México, en este congreso que nos reúne una vez más en torno al pensamiento de Deleuze y Guattari y una vez más en nuestra América. Este espacio común, esas lecturas de Deleuze y de Guattari que tenemos en común, incluso ese hábito que tenemos en común, que es la perplejidad, de sumergirnos una y otra vez en esa textualidad que nos atrapa y nos expulsa, son nuestro ritornero, nuestra morada común, nuestra cancioncita en medio del caos. Pero al mismo tiempo, sentimos, no dejamos de sentir la oscuridad que nos rodea, la fragilidad de estos muros y este congreso, que parecía garantizado año a año durante 13 años, y de pronto la pandemia y las cuarentenas, y se volvió incierto. Incluso mientras escribo estas palabras en la ciudad de Buenos Aires, no tengo ninguna certeza que estaré aquí, como estoy finalmente hoy entre nosotros, porque las cepas y las olas y las guerras, y nuestra vida siempre así. Nuestras vidas son precarias, nuestros planes son precarios, nuestro saber es precario, amenazados por la enfermedad, las cuarentenas y la bruma. Cuando hablo de precariedad, no debe confundirse con la finitud. La finitud tiene una carga desvalorativa de lo existente, que encuentra su verdad en su perecer. Del no reconocer lo finito como un verdadero existente de Hegel al ser para la muerte de Heidegger. La precariedad afirma lo existente, pero no como el felicismo, el canto a que todo está bien en medio de la muerte y el dolor, la autoayuda de que alcanza a compensar en positivo para que todo se resuelva, sino con plena conciencia del volcán sobre el que amamos y vivimos. He hablado otras veces sobre la precariedad. Hoy quisiera detenerme sobre un aspecto vertebral de la precariedad ontológica sobre la cual se monta nuestra precariedad empírica, la forma pura del tiempo. Somos deleuzianos y guattarianos aquí, pero también podemos ser sensatos. Hay una concepción normal del tiempo, según la cual pasado, presente y futuro se suceden en la línea recta del tiempo, de manera cronológica y siguiendo el buen sentido. Ese es el tiempo civilizado, en el cual viven los hombres y mujeres de a pie, como se dice. Y no son pocas las ocasiones en las cuales Deleuze mismo parece emplazarse en el tiempo lineal y referirse a una historia cronológica. En los estudios sobre cine, la cesura entre la imagen-movimiento y la imagen-tiempo está históricamente situada, la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Parados en medio del estruendo de los bombardeos, miramos hacia atrás y vemos el cine de la imagen-movimiento. Volvemos la vista hacia el horizonte y vemos llegar a la imagen-tiempo. En la postdata, las sociedades de control, Deleuze recurre al mismo mojón histórico para marcar el pasaje de las sociedades disciplinarias a las sociedades de control, la Segunda Guerra. Y en sus principales escritos políticos junto a Guattari, el capítulo 3 del Antiedipo, el capítulo sobre el aparato de captura y el tratado de tecnología de las pesetas, el surgimiento del capitalismo aparece fechado históricamente y geográficamente situado. En su principal obra en solitario, Diferencia y Repetición, ofrece en el prefacio una serie de marcas temporales: el aire de los tiempos, el nacimiento del pensamiento moderno y se aproxima la época en que ya no podrá escribir su libro de filosofía como se hace hace tanto tiempo. Más marcas: la distinción entre pintura antigua y moderna en la lógica de la sensación. Si ustedes están haciendo el mismo ejercicio mientras me escuchan, encontrarán, supongo, más ejemplos en ese sentido. Sin embargo, esta enumeración y la multiplicación de ejemplos que podemos añadirle no prueba que Deleuze tuviera, en realidad, una concepción del tiempo normal, lineal y cronológica. No son lapsus de que, más allá de sus fórmulas alocadas, Deleuze sabía que su vida transcurría sobre la flecha del tiempo. Lo que quiero mostrar hoy es que el carácter cronológico, lineal e histórico de estas referencias no debe volcarse a la concepción deleuziana del tiempo, sino que, por el contrario, la concepción deleuziana del tiempo debe tenerse presente cuando leemos aquellas periodizaciones. La imagen-movimiento, la imagen-tiempo, las sociedades disciplinarias y las sociedades de control y las distintas formas de socios no se suceden en realidad en la línea del tiempo. El tiempo en línea recta es, en realidad, un laberinto invisible, incesante, y no una dulce y sólida tierra. Es una recta que se curva formando pliegues en los que no cesamos de perdernos, de caer en un turbio mar embravecido, el océano virtual, pero que al mismo tiempo no deja de lanzar resplandores que ofrecen, como la cubierta de un barco, la efímera sensación de solidez antes de la inexorable tormenta. Se suele pensar que los juegos del tiempo son terreno de la fantasía, mientras el tiempo lineal es la realidad. Pero como decía Burroughs en un texto que Deleuze y Guattari citan en 1000 mesetas, su técnica del kata, cuyo resultado es en apariencia tan caótico e irreal, cito a Burroughs, está mucho más cerca de reflejar los hechos concretos de la percepción humana que la mera linealidad. Fin de la cita. Quizás la ilusión sea que vivimos en un tiempo lineal, en el cual pasado, presente y futuro se suceden meramente. Quizás esa concepción del tiempo sea una ficción y la realidad sea un tiempo que no deja de girar sobre sí mismo, un kata, un collage, un montaje de épocas y tiempos, y también de espacios, lógicas y ontologías incomposibles. O quizás, más precisamente, ambas temporalidades coexistan y nunca dejemos de dudar cuál es virtual y cuál es actual, cuál está muerta y cuál está viva, cuál es verdadera y cuál es una potencia de lo falso. Ese es el tiempo que es nuestro tiempo. Las capas del tiempo que parecen sucederse en el tiempo cronológico en realidad coexisten. Esto vale para la historia, pero también para nuestra vida individual, nuestra biografía. El pasado no cesa de desvanecerse a la luz del presente, pero el presente no cesa de desdoblarse en un pasado que lo conserva y un futuro en el cual se desvanece. La muerte no nos espera al final de la recta del tiempo de nuestra estadía en la Tierra, sino que insiste en cada latido. Pero lo mismo vale para el nacimiento. La vida no cesa de nacer y regenerarse, para luego caer en la penumbra de la asediosa espera de que nada pase, o de que todo pase, ya de una buena vez. Estamos sobre el tiempo, en el tiempo, envueltos por el tiempo, y el tiempo no tiene la solidez del ciclo de las estaciones, ni tampoco la de un camino, aunque descendiente, aunque sea hacia la muerte y la destrucción térmica del universo. La precariedad de nuestra existencia, precariedad social, precariedad psíquica, precariedad económica, precariedad nociológica, refleja la marca de esa furia del tiempo. Pero sobre ese tiempo, y solo sobre ese tiempo, por ese tiempo, gracias a ese tiempo, podemos crear formas de vida. Pero vamos por partes y retomemos las preguntas del inicio. ¿Siempre fue precario el tiempo? ¿O es la precariedad un signo de nuestro tiempo? Pareciera haber algo epocal en la precariedad. Las condiciones del capitalismo, el antropoceno y la posverdad ponen en primer plano la volatilidad de nuestra existencia. Dios ha muerto, el código está fracturado y el leviatán ha bajado sus armas ante el ascenso de la lógica del mercado. Esa precariedad parece acrecentarse en la medida en que nos hundimos en el siglo XXI y la lógica neoliberal desbarata con paciencia y persistencia las estructuras sociales y subjetivas que alguna vez habrían poblado nuestras existencias. Diagnosticar una época de la precariedad implica establecer una cesura con otras épocas caracterizadas en consecuencia por la solidez, las garantías y los fundamentos estables. Dios, el cogito, el estado barroco. Como ya dije rápidamente hace unos minutos, Deleuze, en algunos de sus escritos, no parece ajeno a esta perspectiva. Detengámonos un poco más en el detalle de esas apariciones y la historia cronológica. En los tomos de Capitalismo y Esquizofrenia nos encontramos en las condiciones del capitalismo aparentemente triunfador. No quiero entrar hoy en los detalles de las formaciones que allí se describen y en los desplazamientos y acoplamientos entre el antiedipo y el cetas, sino establecer el carácter epocal que parece marcar las formas de socios y la precariedad creciente que se cierne, siempre siguiendo esta perspectiva sobre la historia universal. Las tribus primitivas habrían tenido códigos fijos y estables, los hombres de Estado los habrían violentado, precarizando en ese sentido la existencia salvaje, para construir con esos ladrillos una gran máquina ordenada y previsible. La decodificación característica del capitalismo habría disuelto esa forma de funcionamiento y dado así lugar a la era de la precariedad, donde todos los sólidos se disuelven en el aire. En la postdata de las sociedades de control, Deleuze, también encontramos un signo epocal y una creciente fragilidad de las formas de existencia. La crisis de los medios de encierro característicos de las sociedades disciplinarias y el surgimiento de las formas gaseosas y fluidas propias de las sociedades de control produce un efecto de precariedad. Una modulación reemplaza a los moldes como forma de individuación. Este corte tiene un carácter explícitamente epocal y una datación relativamente precisa. La Segunda Guerra Mundial. Segunda Guerra Mundial, que es también el punto de cesura entre la imagen-movimiento y la imagen-tiempo en los estudios de Deleuze sobre el cine. Esta nueva época para el cine tiene la marca nuevamente de lo precario. La ruptura de lo sensorio-motriz y la emergencia de la potencia de lo falso nos desamparan. Sin esa trama sensorio-motriz, las imágenes devienen precarias y las verdades se disuelven bajo la potencia inclemente de lo falso. Incluso entra en crisis la noción misma de acción transformadora, produciendo zozobra frente a la injusticia, la destrucción, la crueldad de la realidad material que nos rodea. Las épocas se solapan. La Segunda Guerra Mundial marca la precipitación de la instalación de las sociedades de control y también la transición hacia la imagen-tiempo. La imagen directa del tiempo, la potencia de lo falso, la individuación por modulación y la decodificación forman parte de los puntos singulares que determinan nuestra época, donde la acción, la verdad, los moldes, los códigos y el antropocentrismo se disuelven, produciendo un efecto de precariedad nunca antes visto. Del mismo modo, vale entrelazar las épocas pretéritas, socios despóticos, sociedades disciplinarias y esquemas sensorio-motrices forman parte de una misma lógica que se supone basada y estable. El tiempo de la precariedad es entonces nuestro tiempo y no todo el tiempo. Debemos, sin embargo, cuestionar esa visión epocal desde el punto de vista de Deleuze, porque para él la precariedad es ontológica. La tesis central de diferencia y repetición es, después de todo, la diferencia. La tesis central de diferencia y repetición es, después de todo, que la diferencia es el prius y las formas supuestamente idénticas se dicen de ella. La diferencia no es el fundamento y la garantía de unidad e identidad de las ontologías, sino por el contrario un abismo sin fondo que no cesa de trabajar las identidades. El clamor del ser es una sublime sinfonía, pero también un tsunami, un magma volcánico, un movimiento que ninguna forma puede tolerar. La precariedad no puede nunca conjurarse. Si la precariedad es ontológica, la precariedad no puede ser epocal. No pueden haber existido otras épocas donde la precariedad no hubiera sido el elemento central. La marca de la fragilidad debe designar todas las épocas y no solamente la nuestra. El tiempo se encuentra liberado de su subordinación a las épocas, cuya sucesión habría que medir o marcar para hacerlas coexistir, como decía el compañero, como capas de lo mismo. Y esto porque el tiempo es, en la ontología de Deleuze, la constitución misma de nuestra realidad. Esto ya se observaba en diferencia y repetición, donde solo en el presente el tiempo se desarrolla linealmente, mientras en el pasado las capas coexisten y en el futuro el tiempo se sale de sus bordes para adquirir una existencia autónoma, destructora y creativa. Esta constitución del futuro es así inherente al carácter precario de la ontología, y recíprocamente la precariedad ontológica se nutre de esta constitución salvaje del tiempo. Este carácter del tiempo es retomado y extremado en la imagen tiempo de 1985. Allí Deleuze distingue un tiempo cronológico, donde el presente pasa y deviene pasado, y la fundación del tiempo, donde las coordenadas del tiempo se quiebran y el tiempo, una vez más, sale de sus bordes. Las napas del pasado coexisten en este tiempo puro, y entre ellas se operan saltos cuánticos. Podemos aplicar esta idea a las épocas históricas, dejar de pensarlas como una sucesión cronológica de una línea del tiempo. Desde la perspectiva convencional, el tiempo está subordinado a las épocas que mide, como el tiempo está subordinado al movimiento en la imagen movimiento. Desde la perspectiva de la imagen tiempo, el tiempo se libera y las épocas quedan subordinadas a él, brotando del tiempo que las funda. Es entonces curioso que la imagen tiempo aparezca, como parece indicar la referencia a la Segunda Guerra Mundial, como consecuencia de una cesura epocal. En el cine moderno, señala Deleuze en forma tajante, lo sensorio motriz, cito, y por lo tanto la imagen movimiento que esta caracteriza, no se ejerce más. Este tipo de afirmaciones han llevado a los comentaristas a tomar la cuestión al pie de la letra y pensar que en efecto la imagen tiempo es una nueva era que sepultaría la imagen movimiento como arcaísmo. Sin embargo, Deleuze aclara en la misma página que el esquema sensorio-motriz característico de la imagen-movimiento no por ello es superado en la imagen directa del tiempo, y vuelve taxativamente sobre este punto de la conclusión. Cito, entre la imagen-movimiento y la imagen-tiempo hay muchas transiciones posibles, pasajes casi imperceptibles o incluso mixtos. No podemos decir tampoco que una valga más que la otra, que sea más bella o más profunda. Fin de la cita. Estas cuestiones parecen ser de detalle, o remitir un debate interpretativo en torno a los estudios sobre cine, pero muestran su importancia para pensar el diagnóstico de nuestra época como caracterizada por la precariedad. Quizás las épocas que repasamos hace un ratito puedan ser pensadas en su coexistencia, en lugar de ver una sucesión entre las sociedades disciplinarias y las sociedades de control, entre el estado despótico y el capitalismo, entre la imagen movimiento y la imagen acción. Podemos considerarlos como capas, como diferentes roles en la constitución de las diversas formas precarias que eslaboran nuestra existencia actual, formando lo que Deleuze llama, en sus estudios sobre cine, un cristal, que es básicamente exactamente la misma hipótesis sobre modo de producción que se puso hace un ratito. Se trata de pensar un cristal de la historia, donde pasado y presente sean desdoblamientos o capas que que resuenan en diferentes niveles, creando a cada vez nuevas formas de existencia históricas. Nuestro presente actual, nuestra época, forma un circuito con esa imagen virtual cristalina y no tiene realidad sin él. Son dimensiones del medio histórico en el cual desarrollamos nuestra existencia, nuestro presente actual, y al mismo tiempo conforman una virtualidad pura que es estrictamente correlativa, multiplicando los niveles entre las cuales se puede saltar para crear nuevos presentes a lo que llamaremos futuros. Eso es llevar los seres a su forma precaria, en tanto son facetas de un mismo diamante que no deja de vibrar. Estamos dentro de un tiempo que nos eleva a nuestra existencia precaria. Ese tiempo es una profundidad insondable, de n dimensiones, que se cierran con sus infinitas capas o facetas en torno nuestro y no cesan de caer sobre nosotros. Pasado, presente y futuro son nombres de esas facetas que quedan siempre cortos. Una vez abandonada la línea del tiempo, perdida la orientación circular en sus ciclos, las épocas aparecen como napas talladas en ese cristal eterno. En nuestro presente actual, lo más próximo al fluido y gaseoso y decodificado, y todo lo sólido, codificado y territorial resuena como ecos de un pasado que se nos diluye como esporas de sueños. Sin embargo, esa solidez pretérita es parte de nuestro cristal, coexiste e insiste en él, y por eso no deja de hacerse presente. Dispositivos de encierro, sobrecodificaciones mentales violentas y cadenas en sueño motrices que nos arrastran. Desde el punto de vista de la serie cronológica del tiempo, podrían ser arcaísmos, pero desde el punto de vista del cristal del tiempo son facetas que constituyen también lo real. El pasado resuena de alguna manera inofensivo cuando queda sepultado en un tiempo perdido, que solo retorna como fantasía o nostalgia. Toda mi vida será ayer que me detiene en el pasado, eterna y vieja juventud, que me ha dejado acobardado como un pájaro sin luz. Oh, las viejas épocas, oh, el viejo estilo. Pero desde que el cristal del tiempo lo rescata de ese sepulcro y lo hace parte de nuestra existencia actual, las épocas pretéritas se ciernen sobre nosotros, amenazantes. Las cadenas en suelo motrices de la imagen movimiento, el estado despótico y los dispositivos disciplinarios son una dimensión de lo real con la que tenemos que trenzarnos. Aparecen entonces como opresión y sufrimiento. La lucha ética, política, artística y filosófica sería librarnos de ellos, de sus garras y su asfixia, de acuerdo a un amplio abanico de deseanos y pensadores que se nutren en mayor o menor medida de su potencia, muchos de los cuales han participado de este coloquio. La cuestión no es tan simple, pero sin duda sus arcaísmos en el cristal presentan aspectos nocivos para nosotros. Y ahora, conclusiones. Ahora bien, a pesar de que sea innegable el aspecto tóxico de las napas pretéritas de ese cristal, de la banalidad de las cadenas en suelo motrices, las sociedades disciplinarias y el Estado, esto no debería dejarnos alegremente creer que las otras napas son inherentemente salubres. Cito, no hay lugar para preguntar cuál es el régimen más duro, más tolerable, puesto que en cada uno de ellos se enfrentan liberaciones y sometimientos. Fin de la cita. Deleuze lo dice respecto a las sociedades de control y las disciplinarias, pero puede aplicarse a todas las capas que estamos poniendo desde aquí. Las imágenes del tiempo y la decodificación implican una liberación respecto a los efectos tóxicos pretéritos, pero también efectúan sus sometimientos. Esto se hace elocuente cuando pensamos en las modulaciones de las sociedades de control o en la somática capitalista. La recíproca no es menos cierta. Las cadenas en suelo motrices, el Estado y las disciplinas tienen sus liberaciones. El Estado empírico tiende a ser, es cierto, una maquinaria de opresión al servicio del capitalismo y los intereses de la potenciación del flujo financiero. En el cristal en el que nos encontramos viviendo, capitalismo y Estado son napas que se potencian produciendo asfixia y miseria. Pero no es tan difícil encontrar también dimensiones del Estado que, en las condiciones del capitalismo, aparentemente vencedor, protegen y potencian modos de existencia. El rol clave de los medios de encierro se puso especialmente en evidencia durante la pandemia COVID-19. Los hospitales como lugar de recuperación, aislamiento y tratamiento se han vuelto esenciales para librarnos de un virus que disminuyó la capacidad social de actuar y desarrollarse a niveles nunca antes vistos. La necesidad de suspender la educación presencial para limitar la reproducción del virus y la escalada de contagios, enfermedades y muertes puso de manifiesto, por contrario, el rol positivo del edificio escuela en el desarrollo de la niñez y adolescencia. Y ahora sí, últimas palabras. Lejos estoy de negar los efectos tóxicos del Estado, las sociedades disciplinarias y las cadenas sensorio-motrices. La situación actual es aún más desesperante si consideramos cómo en el cristal de nuestro tiempo esos arcaísmos se potencian por el capitalismo, las sociedades de control y la potencia de lo falso, tanto por verdad. En este tiempo, que es nuestro tiempo, todos los monstruos emergen, haciendo más precaria nuestra existencia, que siempre fue precaria, ontológicamente precaria, más desnudos cada vez, bajo una lluvia cada vez más intensa. Pero justamente por ello aparece el imperativo de transformación de la configuración de nuestro cristal, de cambiar en este tiempo que es el nuestro la forma de resonancia de napas para transformar el Estado y sus medios de encierro. Y allí el rol de la acción transformadora es vital. Lo sensorio motriz no es únicamente la vida bula y la banalidad cotidiana, también es, siguiendo el esquema de la imagen-acción, S a S', la situación de partida a la situación modificada a través de la acción, la posibilidad de transformar la realidad, diagnosticar la situación actual, tomando en cuenta las características del medio, para modificarla en una S', donde las condiciones de la existencia sean más adecuadas para potenciar al máximo nuestra estadía en la Tierra. Crear precarias construcciones, ritornelos, cristales, eligiendo elementos de las napas que resuenan entre nosotros, es una precaria tarea ética y política ante la precariedad en la cual vivimos en nuestro tiempo, que es todos los tiempos, y para la cual espero haber mostrado que les ofrece herramientas fundamentales para pensar.
Breaking the concept, concrete poetry and the means of communication. So, pequeño.
Vamos a darle un poco de eso allá, me parece, sí, evidentemente.
I can wait or I can read a bit of the theory that I decided to cut because it went over time.
Okay. Bueno, ajá,
So, well, I was about to start trying to briefly describe what I had to cut, but maybe I'll try and get to it. I'll also say before beginning an apology to the notables of the world whose names I will most definitely be mispronouncing. So I'll be talking about the movement International Concrete Poetics, which I will also contextualize, but I'll actually skip the context for a bit of theory. Won't make it otherwise. So the rise of new electronic media and their restructuring of the means of communication cannot be overstated. In fact, when considering the theory of language developed by Deleuze and Guattari in their chapter on postulates of linguistics, one must ask if they went far enough in considering how one form of communication media causes shifts in another, as opposed to shifts located at the mutual level of natural languages. To my intuition, the development of digital media, with the development of any medium, reveals something of a flaw in the definition Deleuze and Guattari give for how language persists in a continuous variation of becoming minor that can never be becoming major. The flaw lies in the emphasis on language as opposed to a means or medium of communication. This is partially addressed at precisely the moment Deleuze and Guattari speak of Beckett, Godard and Luca as artists who worked not only in between languages, but between media also. However, is it not, today at least, true that we always work between media? Consider social media in which we're always using images, video, audio, and text simultaneously. Kafka, who the authors speak of primarily in relation to natural languages, as HX speaking in German, Hebrew, was above all an artist who recognized the new media of bureaucracy, or at least its new iteration, in which the human tongue stutters and might only hope to make the machinery of law stutter in its own codes. In fact, one might say that it was the new degree of bureaucracy that functioned as a becoming minor in the disruption of human language, something we see again happening in early AI-generated utterances. The human, regardless of national language, was once the major conduit of expression, but with the rise of information machinery, this began to change. The claim that there cannot be a becoming majoritarian seems deeply flawed when we look at the issue with respect to medium as opposed to natural language. in the traditional sense. Charles Babbage, who first conceived of a programmable digital computer, dubbed it a difference engine, a fact we see in the generative capacities that are now exploding with the assemblage of big data, machine learning, and deepfake technology. The concern I really hope to highlight at this point is that the likes of Kafka were writing at a point where new media forms were beginning to cause fluctuations, new becomings in the dominant assemblage of the alloplastic strata, i.e. natural language. Concrete poetics emphasized these becomings further still, or better put, made apparent their growing force and hints at the capacities for new technologies and above all cybernetics to overcome natural language. As an aside, the debate as to whether the internet is a rhizomatic structure seems to have crucially missed one fact, that the, as such, internet does not exist. There is, in fact, a complex assemblage of different digital and non-digital agents which constitute the internet as we know it. Instead, we must acknowledge precisely the degree to which this is an increasingly rhizomatic internet of things. Thus, while we typically consider the internet as a vast store of content, its characteristic as a multiplicity does not derive from the exponential quantity of content, but from precisely how the internet, much like capitalism, manages to work its way into all facets of our lives, and even of the inhuman strata. Everything from our sexuality, nutrition, transport, and I could go on, have been structurally reconfigured or are in the process of undergoing such a reconfiguration so as to become smarter, meaning algorithmically driven and data producing. Not only entertainment and information, but every dimension of human life is now being tracked and structured in accordance to the possibilities of an internet-driven fourth industrial revolution. Honestly, I see Deleuze and Guattari's theory of language as far too polarized to grasp the nuances in the internet medium, which is both structurally rhizomatic and yet a ubiquitous apparatus of stratification seeking to render all facets of life digitizable. While its structural connection to every dimension of our lives spreads in such decentric ways, the crucial anti-rhizomatic aspect of the internet is how it renders everything recognizable, searchable, and amenable to representation can be identified. Thus, by any Deleuzean account, the internet as a search engine is designed to give you what you are looking for, a theme which is all the more pervasive in social media feeds, which now recognize you and give you content without your having to even search, connecting us to the latest trends in hashtag mode. However, as the Internet of Things evolves, what we come to notice is the increase in information pathways that are unrecognizable to the human, as they are the connections between machines speaking in their own codes. Digital communication today, in turn, is based on this double articulation of a surface or screen level content and that of an almost invisible data production of a diametrically opposite nature. While a consideration of meme culture, for example, reveals much of what would support a post-structuralist theory of language, in which variation instead of normativity is the driving force of linguistic production, all these utterances are in turn coupled with a universal digital code which, instead of promoting further molecular deviations, does the opposite in constructing statistical aggregates of a molar scale to which subjects, no longer that of an individual body, but of a individual economy, can be assigned and thus regulated. A similar case can be seen in the proliferation of visual communication into all dimensions of the public sphere during the post-war era. And now I do in fact need to probably...
Almost there.
Yeah. Well, I'll read the introduction, I suppose.
You can read it. The sound of the
I'm trying to figure out what would structurally flow best to finish this point. But while there I speak a lot about the internet, while I will be speaking of this as a movement that slightly predates Deleuze and Guattari's writings, at least together. And here we go. And I hope more so points to a media shift that we are undergoing now again with digital and its impact. So, yeah, good.
Nuestra América fuera.
I'll finish this point, so could you skip on maybe 2 slides, I think? So then, yeah, this one. Okay, perfect, thank you. So, as I was saying, a similar case can be seen with the proliferation of visual communication into all dimensions of the public sphere during the post-war era. In considering this, I would like to begin with Guattari's Brazilian poem Life, for a number of reasons. Firstly, today the work has taken on a new meaning in light of Deleuze's work Immanence, a Life, especially when placed alongside the computational research of Stefan Wolfram, which constructed patterns from simple elements which may take on a lively, independent nature. The poem itself reflects this in the development of pictograms, which gradually become evident as Latin script, before shifting naturally into the ancient Chinese calligraphic symbol for the sun, which may also be an infinity, as well as the number 8 of a digital display, which is of course the maximum usage of the display possibilities. Before revealing the source of these elements as the title of the American Life magazine, which is of course a leading cultural institution at the time. The reduction of letters to pictogrammatic elements suggests both a past form of writings as well as a now-present future in which mass communication is no longer script-based but encompasses an intersection of media, most notably images, a fact that was made clear with Life magazine, but now constitutes one of the main forms of contemporary communication that is by no means limited to a single publication, i.e. means. We must note here the full intricacy of the tension between a highly regulated development of the units of pictorial language still contained in the Western format of left to right, which no less aim at infinite possibilities of variation before having this infinity of language consumed and continued within the logotype of life, which tellingly does not include the pictogram of the sun and infinity. Despite what the name might suggest, thus we see a direct response to the contemporary communication paradigm and its influences on language, as well as a meditation on how language itself is both moving towards variation and always contained within the limits of a medium. On that note, it seems to me that this phenomenon is recurrent today with audiovisual content within a digital difference machine, contained by the regulation and formatting of platforms. If we could go back one, this is actually my introduction. So, a fundamental concern I raise, probably have raised, that many are raising here and around the world, is that of the degree to which state control is embedded in the infrastructure of communication. In this manner, my talk is largely a response to Deleuze's postscripts on the society of control, as well as Guattari's Three Ecologies, which claims that action at any level arises through a control of the means of communication along that strata. The developments of surveillance capitalism and its auxiliary technologies thus pose the most significant threat to our current times, as today's IT monopolies such as Google and Meta, to name only the most infamous, dominate global communication and thus political discourse. And if we know Guattari's Three Ecologies, with the control of communication comes the control of any political or psychological change. Thus, this is due to the fact that any outcry, no matter how radical, may ultimately be turned into data points and thus commodified and used to further regulate populations. The issue of control is not new, however, in fact the opposite. Frederick Hitler argued that the two are essentially indistinguishable, that is, the state and control. The state is nothing more than the regulation of information, as in the eyes of the state, material resources and bodies, whether they are called telephone, radio and television, or water supply, electricity and highway, are all information only because every modern stream of energy needs a parallel control network. My main concern here is with the impact this has on our own use of media, as well as our own mediation. Any technological advance as defined by the deterritorialization that it entails. What is particular about the current so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution is precisely the threat it poses to the medium of writing. Thus, in turn, to the typical understanding of philosophy that may soon become outmoded. I choose writing because from Plato to Deleuze and Guattari, and still largely to this day, writing has been the medium in which philosophy takes place. However, the subsumption of writing by quote-unquote new media did not start with the internet. Instead, it began in the heart of the 20th century. Thus, while today's media landscape is radically altered through the interventions of digital technologies, the question I will address tangentially, the present talk, is instead a retrospective look at the impact of new media and cybernetics on writings in the post-war era. I claim this is pragmatic in that it helps to both situate a shift in mediation of communication in Deleuze and Guattari's time, as well as offer a framework that may be compared relatively to what is taking place now. So, for those who are not aware, international concrete poetry is a particular movement within the literary and artistic genre of visual poetics, which took place between 1950 and 1970. The time is significant as it places them right before the writings of Deleuze and Guattari, and yet we shall see that they shared many of the same concerns. It is important to stress that concrete poetics is not simply a formal development, but an articulated response to the technological and political developments that took place around the world in the post-war era. Namely, a response to new politico-economic order of globalization and the mass media technologies such as radio and television that accompanied it. International concrete poetry developed in a number of different countries, originating first in Brazil and Switzerland in response to what was most certainly a global shift in both the content and form of communication. However, above all, concrete poetry may be said to be responding to the increasing role of cybernetics and data science in global politics and economics. It is in this manner that one should read the early poem by Augusto de Campos. It should not be read as a cheap formal play on the digit zero, but a somber meditation on the difficult practice of enumerating the peasant population of northern Brazil in the national census of 1962. The poem is explicitly about the conflict between the rapid modernization of Brazil and its collective cultures, and leads into a wider investigation of how statistics and data production link up to models of mass production in the 20th century modernism. Thus, what we are looking at is not so much a formal experimentation taking place within printed language alone, but a radical reconfiguration of the assemblage in which writing is merely a part. This reconfiguration, however, changes writing utterly, a fact which is the case with every such media shift, but is perhaps most evident in the works of concrete poetry. This poem, which in English begins without a number, which is transformed through the central zero, or O, until it ends as one without number, may then be read to describe the process by which a state takes a people, assigns identity codes, ultimately reducing the person to an informational point or nothing, which is ultimately stripped of its collective identity. As Andrew Cope remarks, we live in an era of disillusion. As with any period, its social character is defined largely by its media forms. Today, we are blown to bits, thought to be acting out the programming of hidden codes. I'll also note that while these poems may seem very simple on the surface, though they will complexify, it is crucial to know that these were often printed and displayed as posters outdoors for the masses rather than for a closed circle of literary elites. So we can go on to two more slides. So, the process of subjectification by which the subject is constituted from a life is derived from the Latin subjectus, to be brought under, designating the power afforded to a person by virtue of subordination to another. The question of subjectivity abounds throughout concrete poetics, in much the same way as it did in French philosophy during and immediately after. The issue, after all, is a global one. namely the process by which communication technologies are turned into means of capture which solidify identity for the sake of communication, commodification and control. While there is a romantic desire to connect Vladimir Burda's poem "Ik" to a human history of communication starting with the cave paintings of Lascaux, a reading which is valid so long as one also takes into account the sudden shift from a collective expression to that of a hyper-isolated individual, the reading should not stop there. Crucially, such a fingerprint marking not only emphasizes the material and body with which communication always begins, but also the new technologies with which an individual is recorded and identified, technologies which are only very recent in human history, and such actively constitute a new degree of subjectification. Simultaneously, this emphasis on the new biometric forms of identification point to a lost past and a new future in which the word may be only a fleeting anachronistic translation. The question arises if biometrics could one day suffice to remove the need for legal names entirely. For context, this piece was made in GDR in Berlin. Go on to the next slide, please. If we look at the following poem titled Manifest by Bohumila Yergorova and Josef Hirschal, we encounter this inextricable process of grammatization, whereby language is never a pure communication, but a technological operation, a process which is always rendered particular and thus, in a sense, untranslatable. Though the poem does not necessarily mean anything, the attempt to use such a keyboard as that which is evidently presented here would not be so simple an endeavour globally, for the keyboard is not Anglophone, which would have been considered the typical QWERTY format, but a QWERTZ keyboard. Thus the operation of such a keyboard, even by users of Romance groups, would be encumbered and foreshadows Stiegler's theory of grammatization without needing to express a linguistic statement, instead simply making apparent what is always and already manifest. Consider then, the keyboard is still fitted to only Roman scripts with the addition of umlauts, and we realize that the increasingly universal technologies of communication through which one can participate in the public sphere are hardly exclusionary apparatuses and define the society of control through access as opposed to discipline. Grammatization, as described by Stiegler, is the process by which memory and technological operation are formulated, two activities which take place in parallel as the same process. For the use of any tool is the formation of memory as to how the tool is used, and thus how one acts in the world or what constitutes the world to the core. Furthermore, increasingly technology involves the externalization of memory or mnemotechnics, a question that goes back to the heart of philosophy with Plato's Phaedrus. It would be true to say that the issue I raise is perhaps as old as this Greek conception of philosophy, namely concerned with what the Greeks called a pharmakon. It seems to me that Marshall McLuhan redefined the pharmakon in his formulation of media as the configuration of sensory ratios, that is, the proportions of variable intensities which constitute a given subject and their means of operating within the world. This question, that goes back at least to the Phaedrus, may also be said to be a guiding thread of 1,000 Plateaus, when the two authors elaborate in perceptual semiotics. Perceptual semiotics is the reorientation of perspective to look in the middle or in media. It is also telling that one of the key methods of doing so is a subtraction, the n-1 of dimensions. Without elaborating too much on the theory, what might this mean in practice? Well, I believe that various members of the international concrete poetics movement attempted just this, and in two major ways. The first being the escape from the dominance of a Latin script, finding in transnational language pictograms new lines of flight into sense and semiotic structures that seem entirely nonsensical to our literate eyes. We can go on to the next slide, please. In another poem by Tezio Guattari, this one very fittingly titled Semiotic Poem, we see an exemplar case, sadly there's a piece of paper cut off here, we see an exemplar case of perceptual semiotics as praxis. The work is both a response to the growing relevance of television in the cultural sphere through a poem which is ostensibly about the televised phenomenon of the FIFA World Cup, which also manages to escape the confines of the written script, while pushing the semantic properties of pictograms through their precise modulation of basic elements. Here these three elements are Pelé, the world-famous Brazilian football player represented by a circle, obviously. The country is the amplified family with television, shortened here to a rhombus shape. And finally, at the end, which is a rectangle, at the end all ends well, which is symbolized by a rectangle reminiscent of a television screen. Aside from the commentary on Brazilian culture and politics, the poem is an experiment in exploding structuralism. Pelé, represented by a black circle in the poem, exists in a spatial relation to the nation of Brazil or the world, the amplified family with television set, and in effective relationship to the idea that at the end all ends well. At the top of the poem, Pelé exists in multiple outside of the amplified family, but within the feeling that things end well, the subsequent arrangements can be understood in various ways, with some of the lexical shapes intersecting or fragmenting in meaningful arrangements. The challenge for the reader or decoder is to keep the concepts associated with the shapes in mind while apprehending the arrangements. It is quite simple in the case of Pelé. The black circle stands in for a single person, easily comprehensible. But the more complex definitions associated with the rectangle and the rhombus are more difficult to manage in one's mind and much more difficult to imagine in their various modulations. How exactly does a feeling split in half or rotate 45 degrees? The issue of translation and its impossibility in the face of growing cybernetic tendency is amplified by the inclusion of a lexical key that ought to make the seemingly simple poem very easy to read. Translation was always a key question for the overtly transnational aims of concrete poetry. Next slide, please. We may take, for instance, Eugene Gomringer's Wind. Gomringer was a Swiss Bolivian who worked in Germany and whose work here typifies the tendencies that may be said to epitomize the second method by which concrete poetics sought to subtract, à la Deleuze and Guattari, the dimensions specific to writing, namely linearity. Wind, for instance, not only uses a scattered method of writing to represent the to and fro of a heavy gust, but in so doing ushered in a new vision, a whole new perceptual semiotics, still situated within the Latin script, yet which does not follow the linear dimensionality and order of Western alphabets. Instead of adding a new ordering principle, the simple subtraction of the established one reveals entirely new modes of reading, which at once set the eyes moving across a smooth page as opposed to a typical linear striation on which writing was always based. Add to this indeterminacy of direction a sonic indeterminacy when one realizes that the poem may be read aloud in either English as wind or German as Wind, signals the poem's participation not so much in as a signifier to a signified, but as an assemblage bridging two linguistic communities. Utilizing these techniques, the poem escapes the level of singular identity and order which the state apparatus forces, instead returning a movement and variation into the printed medium. This poem, though small and simple, I imagine was a precursor to the later radical shift in concrete poetics that moved away from semantics entirely. We can move on to the next slide, please. Instead, taking the molecular elements of language as well as the means of production involved and loosening them entirely from the dictums of representation. Without any analysis, I would like to end with 2 pages from Steve McCaffrey's Carnival, a book-length poem which may be said to bring this tradition to a completion of sorts in its insistence on the book's pages being torn out and arranged in sequence of mandala-like panels, undoing the order that the book as physical object enforces while placing the reader in a participatory relationship to the establishment of the text. In considering these poems by McCaffrey, I recall the internet of old, that wild and untamed expanse that seemed to be held together by dial-up sounds and helpful virtual paper clips, which has now been replaced by a platform capitalism. I do not claim to have offered a sufficient commentary on today's digital era, but in considering these past deterritorializations of writing and how accurately they depict the theoretical concerns Deleuze and Guattari would later make explicit, I hope we can be more attentive to similar events happening as we speak. Neither writing nor that which was once new media will be left unscathed. There is much I have left out, and I must admit I am often reminded of Geert Lovik's assessment of today's internet, in which we're all mere users with every attempt at expression like a narcotic haze from which only IT companies profit, like digital drug traffickers. Despite this, however, looking at the work of international concrete poetics does give me the confidence that there are unexpected virtues to be unearthed if we can only tackle the medium on its own terms. We must remember that writing too was initially a medium for state control and commerce.
Thank you very much, Helen. So we have time enough for comments, questions. Yes.
Yeah, as Freedom's up there, I wonder if I could ask him a question, which occurred to me with the last diagram, that, for example, in the 1960s, the Fluxus was experimenting with concrete poetry, but also with graphic music. And so I wondered if you saw a connection between graphic scripts and concrete poetry.
Yeah, I suppose, so most of this work was focused on the early concrete poetics, especially that which was influenced or based in Brazil, which was still very semiotic and language-based and pushing it within that area. But towards the end, they really explored what can be semiotic and what can be communicative, as well as playing on this intersection or intermediality, which I think is extremely relevant to how we actually communicate now. So while this seems awfully experimental, it seems a precursor to the kind of means by which we communicate through images, video, and audio all simultaneously in this kind of jungle using social network technologies. So just as, say, Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari's theories of language seemed so crazy and out there, when we look at how language or content is produced online, we really see exactly kind of an elaboration of what they, or we see examples of what they elaborated in theory. And the same could be said for, how a development from Fluxus was continued with this, that I think is now ubiquitous in communication. I don't know if that went tangentially.
Did you see a connection with graphic music?
So, with graphic music, I think so. I think it's a general trend towards the bringing together of as many different mediums as possible, which in the early 20th century and before the 20th century were very separate, by and large. There's probably examples to counter that. But anyway.
Julián.
Bueno, tengo preguntas and questions for all my colleagues, thank you. I'm fishing a word from the very dark hole, but I will go in order. I like very much your paper. Maybe you didn't understand mine, but we were in the same line, the same idea of how we think, break with this chronological idea of time. And I haven't thought about what you said, precisely about the different forms of modes of production or forms of socius in Deleuze and Guattari. They are already there, the keys to try to make them coexist. But I have two questions that are for you, but not objection, but the things I wonder how to articulate. Because Urstadt was great idea, that great idea. I will steal this idea. No, I will quote, I'm sorry, quote this idea. But in some play chapters, we have the capitalism where this is the contrary. It's like the capitalism will emerge with time and in a moment. So there is a very good example, but in the very same passage, some pages after, we have to take it down, show how. And also capitalism coexists. I believe that where we have to reach, but how we believe we can surpass this kind of problem. And the other problem I have is with Spinoza on ontology. I like also the idea of immanent cause and bringing it to the problem. But the problem is that when Deleuze reads Spinoza, we make very clear distinction between the mode of the essence of a mode and the existence of a mode. And I would tend to put politics in the existence of the mode, so maybe we can keep the modes of production like essences, and then some contingencies of actual existence, bring them to existence. You understand the question? In some part of Spinoza, he goes with us in our theory, but then we have this whole field of existence and struggle. So, para ti tengo la pregunta que es más que es un comentario que una pregunta. Es fascinante la idea, y como acababa de escucharlo a él hablar de Marx, cuando dijiste Robinsonadas incluso. Cuando dijiste Robinsonadas pensé en la famosa cita de Marx donde el pescador y el cazador aislados pertenecen a las Robinsonadas del siglo XVIII. Y me pareció fantástico porque un poco la Robinsonada cambia de sentido de Marx a Deleuze, donde deja de ser la idea, la fantasía liberal de la persona autoconformada, sino que la Robinsonada es eso, la Robinsonada es la persona que se disuelve en el mundo, y de ahí la sociedad aparecería como lo que puede dar, desde el punto de vista, para bien, no sé, para el tuyo, cierta estructura, cierto mundo, en el cual no podemos vivir. Yo preferiría no morir. And for you, I'm closing with the question for you, but I like very much the idea because it takes backwards problems of the internet to actual for it's a current event that Deleuze couldn't see. It's great to see how he could see forwards, but it's strange. And I thought, well, you saw when he talks about the death of man in Foucault, that he will try to bring into the new characteristic of the Übermensch the idea of machines of the first generation. And there is this also what you try to make, that to take it to a positive level, because he seems to be liking this idea of Übermensch, and one of the characteristics is third generation machines, and I like to see them already there. And what do you think? Do you think that you can link to this idea of Übermensch in the Deleuzian sense?
Do you want answers? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, comments to the comments. Do you think we can go anywhere with this idea? So
Yeah.
I think it's an issue, you know.
Well, I think the first, what do we do with capitalism emerging? And I think that the only way to get through that is to say, okay, so then imposing some sort of Bergsonian virtual actual distinction, or like phenomenologists, what they're doing with realization and actuality, and I think that problem resolves itself. Yeah, like very quickly. It's like, yes, capital is here.
Quickly, easily, maybe.
Yeah. Capital is here as a virtuality all the time, and it becomes well, for Bergson, it's instantly actualized, and I think that would solve a lot. I think that would get past that. The question about Spinoza, well, does Spinoza really grant the existence of an essence as like Deleuze seemed, by Deleuze's reading, it's like substance as sort of disappears, and it becomes substance is a multiplicity, substance is an ontogenetic field, and and see them done. So I think like I would go with like Deleuze on this as opposed to, and I know like they're like if there's any Spinozas in the room, this would be a great point to go, well, yes, Deleuze thought that, Negre thought that, and no one else. But you know, like yeah,
You can.
yeah,
Okay. All right.
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Where do you go
Yeah.
from here?
Yeah.
Solo un breve comentario que tú me hacías. Sí, efectivamente estoy completamente de acuerdo. La sociedad tiene que ser una estructura que abra posibilidad, que abra acción, que abra etcétera. Pero solo a condición de romper con esa estructura epistemológica fuerte de un yo que se impone sobre su mundo, de lo que yo quería hacer. Y en una dimensión de tiempo para pasar a tu ponencia también, y de una vez hago una pequeña pregunta antes de que hable mi compañero, que efectivamente tenemos que tener una experiencia y una dimensión de tiempo distinta a la cronológica, pero que se mete en la cronológica también. Y entonces yo extraño un poco la explicación de Deleuze sobre el ayón, ¿no? Sobre el ayón. Esto es lo que yo quisiera que te extendieras un poquito. Gracias. Pues,
yeah, so if I try to think of people who quite literally answered theoretically, the worrisome answer of Nick Land comes up and tried to formulate this kind of post-human emerging through capitalist technologies. My one concern that I perhaps hinted at here, but didn't get round to, following from Sieger's grammatization, is this kind of split that happens. While before, in becoming literate, we simply need to know how to kind of work the material, and then I can participate in communication and participate in that communicative community. Digital technology has this weird interface and infrastructure divide where you may be able to use a computer and communicate with people, but you're certainly not participating in the coding or the actual digital communication, and that seemingly is very much being used against us. And we're seeing this, I at least feel this moment where we're all kind of amazed with, you know, new writing, new visual art, and kind of these new possibilities. But that's very literally happening at a surface level or a screen level, and the kind of significant communicative developments are happening in, you know, warehouses of servers and whatever. And that's where kind of global control, which is also psychological control, is taking place, and we're excluded from that largely. So, to answer that question of what would like a new communicative Uberman be, given the fact that digital communication, it radically subsumes every other form before, because if you're working on that surface level, you're not actually in tune with it. So yeah, that calls for a new definition of literacy, if it really is as all-encompassing as it seems.
But it does, because the three levels of the verbiage are literature, computers, and life, viruses and that. So it should be literature, and also, but it will be only human. It will be like linking of the level.
Well, so that interlinking has already happened, but most of us are not literate in the sense of digital literacy of the coding sort. And yet we're kind of kidding ourselves constantly because we seem to have this potential to interact. But so the real concern is, if that replaces writing, what is the consequence for philosophy?
I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question for Robert. So, you say that everything exists from the beginning, so the state exists, capitalism exists. How do we distinguish this from Platonism?
What?
From Platonism. because you say, okay, the state state exists or capitalism exists at the beginning, but in what sense? Because, you know, there's not yet a meeting of kind of capital or laborers, or it's not there any material or concrete conditions.
There is,
to
They're
exist.
city.
Yeah.
They're cities from the beginning, that's the concrete condition.
Yeah, but there maybe even the cities might be disembodied in a certain sense.
Disembodied cities. No, I'm talking, there are physical cities.
Yeah,
They're
but
not
not-
disembodied.
Yeah, but nothing less than.
Not yet.
Less than. Yeah.
Peer clusters, there is the state, and it is a form of organization, and he is literally talking about explicitly, yes, these physical places, and he was certainly aware of that. The archaeological digs of Catalhayuk. So yes, it is. There are cities, and the non-state also exists. They're the nomads. Do they inhabit the same spatio-temporal coordinates? Sure, in brief moments. Yeah, maybe I missed it, your question.
No. I'm just because you just introduced this actual virtual distinction.
Yeah.
Which would make all of these things tendencies, and not things, right? A state is a tendency. It's not.
The virtual actual distinction,
Yeah.
each of those is real.
Yeah. No, I understand. I understand, but it's not real as a table is real. It's real as a mode of organizing the world, as a rhythm, let's say.
Yeah, they're both real, like, they're strictly coexistent.
Could I jump in on that question in a way? Or are we over time?
I don't know.
I was wondering, so if Roshka exists in virtually along with whatever nomadic option, is it also pre-human, or does the human bring about the necessary conditions for that to also arise in the virtual, whether it then is actualized or not, linearly or not, is another question. But at what point does it arise in the virtual?
Okay. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the virtual and the actual wrong. But like, I thought they were completely coexistent and co-emergent, and it's not a first, second, there's no ontological primacy in a virtual actual distinction. And if there's no ontological primacy and there's no ontological dependency relationship here, then there can be no sort of
I feel that in my understanding, there can be something can be virtual without being actualized, but something which has been actualized would probably have been.
Well, Bergson, I think himself was confused on this. Like, in 7 pages in Creative Evolution, he offers like 8 definitions. And then that's one, and then it's like, okay, yeah, well, surely this is clearer in matter memory. No, it's not, and then in the 2 dialogues, it's also not clear. However, one time he does say, look, these things are co-emergent, and that seems to be the final definition. At least that was the one that Proust is talking about. That's the one that Hippolyte is going with, and it's sort of like, and I'm also on that bandwagon. So they're strictly coextensive entities.
Does it emerge with the conditions of something very human, or is it earlier than the?
No. Bergson was doing metaphysics. He was doing metaphysics and like
The Urstadt, I mean.
is it a strictly human thing?
Yeah, does it
Could
emerge from the conditions of something human, or is it is it part of
Any sort of society. And are there a society of animals? Yeah, we're animals. And so, like, we're just human animals. But essentially, we're animals.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, so we're, like, and then if you go into Delanda's reading, it's like, no, it doesn't even have to be animals. And honestly, if you go into Spinoza's reading, it doesn't have to be, you know, like, and everybody loses their shit at that point and says, well, you couldn't be talking.
Maybe so it does still have humans. We are not necessary.
Yeah.
Contingent. But if I can jump into this answer, I believe that in difference of repetition, Deleuze goes and comes and goes. It's not there are some quotes that support the idea that there is some virtual without actual, because actualization can be a little confusing. The literature in Deleuze is struggling with this problem all the time. That's very funny. But I believe that in the cinema books, in Time Image, he's very clear, and I believe he's trying to take his position on this, and that's what is coexistence, absolute coexistence.
Yeah. And you even find that earlier on in cinema books, like you find that in Bergson's concept of difference, you find it in the Bergson article that he wrote for the thing that Merleau-Ponty was editing.
Yeah, but then you can say, no, but he's not really talking about him. This is the argument.
Right.
He's talking about Bergson, about himself, but I think this is the spirit of his virtual actual concept was always this coexistence.
Yeah.
What I say, in different repetition, there are some quotes that you can take to.
Yes. But like
We cannot deny it.
Yeah, if you want to line at it, that's trouble.
But I think you have to struggle with the meaning of that sentence, not overlook them.
Yeah.
What's the point here?
Yeah.
There is some point here that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Problem.
I propose to you, we have two mixed conference next tables, so I propose to just have one table at the other room, so we can be all together.
That's a good idea. Yeah, good news.
Yeah, that's great.
Very.
Thank you very much.